talk a little about the origin of the current financial crisis, which is a major cause of the broader economic crisis that people are talking a little more about these days, and what governments have been and should do about the financial crisis. And if you have read papers lately, anytime lately, you'll have noticed that Western and other governments have been pumping in money into financial markets by the trillion. So just in case you've forgotten, a trillion is 1 followed by 12 zeros. It's a really, really big number. With increases announced just yesterday in Washington, the U.S. government alone will have directly invested, lent, or assumed liabilities totaling more than $4 trillion in the U.S. economy. This is an expense exceeding by many times anything ever spent on recovery from an earthquake or from a hurricane, and it's more in the scale of fighting a modern war. It's a mind-boggling amount. The question is, and we should be asking ourselves this question, all of us should, is why? Why? These trillions of dollars are intended, and this is the answer why, to shore up trust in financial markets. The mind-boggling scale of this investment reveals how important trust is to financial markets. Trust is what enables financial markets, enables modern society to function. It's crucial. We need those markets to do things like use credit to buy a car, or buy a house, or build retirement funds that Karen was talking about, or invest in personal, ordinary, everyday savings. And a crucial part of this system is financial intermediation. For example, I might like to borrow a house with an interest rate fixed for 5 years. That's an ordinary term mortgage. But on my own, it might be hard to convince someone to lend me money on those terms, or hard to communicate to that person the more or less certain promise that I'll pay that person back. And that's where banks and other financial institutions come into play. By taking deposits from someone else, or from selling 5-year guaranteed investment certificates, those are GICs, a lot of people buy those, and lending the proceeds to me in the form of a mortgage, then Derek's company, for example, they make the markets work better, and that's important. Suppose Karen, she invests in the GIC sold by Derek's bank. She's better off than if she lends directly to me, because she doesn't have to seek out, she doesn't have to try and figure out if I'm going to pay her back. She can rely on Derek's reputation, or Derek's bank's reputation, or their public financial statements, or their reports to government regulators. And those things establish her confidence, her trust that she can be paid back when she goes to redeem her certificates. So what's happened here? Derek's bank, in this example, he takes on a commitment to honor depositors' potential future withdrawals, or to honor Karen's GIC when she goes to redeem it in 5 years. But the bank is exposed to the risk that I might not be able to repay the mortgage. So what if the bank could reduce the cost of bearing that risk? It could then charge me less interest, less for my mortgage. It could pay depositors a higher return on their investments or on their savings. It could pay employees higher wages, or it could pay the shareholders more dividends. So that's good for the economy. It's good for all of us. And this is where intermediation comes into play, because the financial institution can do even better. It can pool together those mortgages. It can pool together mortgages and holds on homes in different regions, or in different sectors, or different size mortgages, or mortgages of different term. And it could sell claims of that pool. It could take Peter Victor and Grace Edward, they might be looking to earn more interest on their savings than they could from a bank account. So in exchange for taking on some of the risk that I or other my borrowers might fail to repay, they get a higher return. So the proceeds of selling these interests, which are used to honor Karen's GICs at the end of the day, and the money Peter and Grace Edward earn from the income generated by they get paid from my monthly mortgage payments. So that's why the claims that Peter and Grace Edward have bought are called mortgage-backed securities. And that's where all the trouble started in the US. One of the things that's very different about the world now, as opposed to back in 2007, is that there aren't many of us who haven't heard of mortgage-backed securities. Where it's these things that lay at the basis, that lay at the heart of the recent financial market meltdown. And it was the failure of the US government-guided system, the rules for generating and distributing these securities, and misplaced trust in that system, which gets the biggest burden of blame for the current financial troubles. You see, for example, in a typical US mortgage transaction, a loan officer receives and processes for a fee a mortgage loan application. But so as not to keep the risk on the bank's own balance sheet, the loan is almost always sold on to or insured by one of the few government-sponsored businesses. And these are the ones that people hear of are Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the Federal Home Loan Bank. I'll just talk about Fannie Mae. The market for underwriting and insuring mortgages in the U.S. has for years been dominated by Fannie and Freddie. These are publicly traded companies, but they're controlled as to what they can or can't do or must do by federal legislation. Well, so what could go wrong in this marketplace? Beginning in the late 1990s, Congress and the Clinton White House put huge pressure on Fannie and Freddie to guarantee more mortgages for people whose incomes, credit ratings, and savings were not otherwise good enough. Fannie Mae's CEO said there were too many borrowers whose credit was just a notch below what their standards required. The mortgage originators in the U.S. were glad to play along and lower the standards, or play along with lower standards, because they collected a lot of fees along the way. So Fannie and her private sector co-conspirators aggressively built their businesses. They generously donated money to the congressman who wrote the legislation that permitted to do so. The market expanded by the trillion. That's trillions again. The managers at Fannie paid themselves millions of dollars in bonuses for expanding the business. They even cooked the books. They even cooked the books so that they could pay themselves more. So meanwhile, investors in the US, Canada, Europe, and China invested in the securities that underwrote all that mortgage borrowing. Now why? Why did they trust so? Well, all of these investors, institutional investors, individual investors, they did so because although the government denied it, the investors guessed correctly in the end that the US government would be forced to backstop the loans if anything should go wrong. And go wrong it did. So what we've got is an example of how regulation and confused financial and political incentives shattered the ordinary trust and responsibility that should have governed everyday mortgage lending. Now, few among us who spotted the risk that Fannie Mae posed also guessed how quickly or how broadly that poisoned trust could spread. Financial institutions that ordinarily lend to each other overnight or for a few months at a time and at very cheap rates, they began last summer to hoard cash instead because they needed to be ready to honor debts if called on themselves to repay. And they had a difficult time making sure that their counterparties, the people who wanted to borrow from them, could in turn repay it fast. Now, the point, of course, is that if financial institutions don't work, we can't buy or sell houses very easily, or cars, or groceries. And if people can't save or invest with decent confidence that they'll get their money back when they need it, then we're in grave trouble. So another thing we have to bear in mind is that the financial sector isn't like the auto business. If car companies go bust, that's bad for a lot of people. But without a decently functioning financial system, we're all in a bad or worse spot. And that is why governments have been feverishly backstopping financial institutions around the world. Banks need to know that their counterparties have the capital to withstand big shocks to their balance sheets. Depositors need to know that their banks are financially stable. It's an unfortunate situation. It kind of sucks. And it's one that probably didn't need to happen, but it's the situation we're in. So job one for governments is to keep the financial system moving, and at least in Canada, we're not doing too bad a job of it. But buying trust is expensive, and even though buying trust is very, very expensive, it's the right thing to do. And we're doing the right thing. Thanks.
A hall full of people on Wednesday night talking about financial markets. This is unusual. So maybe we should take the opportunity to actually say as much as we can. Yeah, first of all, I wish there was more trust between management and workers, because I think to some extent that's really where this story begins and ends. And you will not be surprised to learn that, unlike Finn, I actually think that the problem was not too much regulation, the problem was deregulation. It wasn't that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were forced, regulated into a corner where they ended up handing out bad mortgages. I think the problem was much broader than that and had a lot to do with deregulation. And I'll talk about that. I think that the response really has to be what people talked about as the bringing back of government into the organization of the economy, which is what we have not had for the last quarter century. Earlier this week, Prime Minister Stephen Harper was quoted as saying the following: "Deficits are generally bad, But there are occasions in which deficits are not necessarily bad, but in fact are essential. Now, obviously, some of us have waited to hear the Prime Minister say that for a long, long time. This grudging concession to reality comes from someone who has made his career, the goal of his career, the demonizing of a positive role for government in the economy, whether as the head of the National Citizens Coalition or as a politician or more recently as Prime Minister. Yet Mr. Harper's words should not have come as a surprise, since it is in this current financial and ideological crisis, because it's not just a financial crisis, it's also an ideological crisis, that has finally forced him and others like him to adopt the sensible position held by progressives for a very long time. Deficits if necessary, but not necessarily deficits. In fact, Alan Greenspan, who some of you would know, as the former Fed chair in the United States, also offered a mea culpa recently, saying they were wrong to force deregulation to the extent that they did. And yet the last quarter century, a radical theology that has railed against deficit spending as though it were inherently evil has dominated public policy. So much so that our social and physical infrastructure has degenerated with minimal action being taken, impacting the competitiveness of our economy and leaving local communities to fend for themselves and pick up the pieces. Interestingly, today in the Toronto Star, the former governor of the Bank of Canada is quoted as saying, "It is a good time to build those bridges, build those roads, which by policy we neglected in the 1990s because we were broke." Aside from the obvious question as to whether the policies responsible for this neglect were not highly irresponsible, one has to ask the question, why did we let the bridges and roads fall into disrepair when we were running huge surpluses or had projected huge surpluses? Why did the bridge in Montreal collapse a few years ago and take 2 lives? Why did the levees in New Orleans break during Katrina and take both lives and futures? The answer can be found in the anti-government neoliberal ideology and its destructive dominance that suffocated any meaningful discussion of a sustainable economy as an alternative to our economy, until the crisis caught up with us these last few months and it forced the high priests of unfettered market forces and deregulation off of their high horses. The wreckage of these policies is everywhere now and is stripped bare for all to see. While the American situation has gained most of the media attention, and it seems to be the most dramatic, there is chaos around the world. There's chaos in the global south and the global north. The crisis in the financial markets is a global phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon from which we cannot defend ourselves, even though we are in a somewhat better position in Canada than many elsewhere, certainly the Americans are, because our process of deregulation was not as thoroughgoing as the American one was. It makes sense for us to resist the advocacy of those financial barons who have been asking for banking reform and deregulation. Ironically, it is interesting that many of them are now standing up and saying Canada is in a better position than the United States because we had more foresight than the Americans did. But the reality is that we are in the same boat. As a trading nation, we certainly are affected directly by the collapse in consumer spending in the United States and contraction in production in not just the United States, but also especially Asia and other parts of the world. And in Canada, the cascade of job losses is already underway. Karen spoke to some of that. This week we heard that there's a possibility of 15,000 jobs that might be lost in the automobile industry in central Canada, which clearly would decimate the manufacturing sector here. The resource industry is not far behind, and we'll hear about that maybe later on. Canada's unemployment rates will soon rise past the 7% mark and likely go into double digits. This unemployment and weaknesses in wages is juxtaposed against high indebtedness and low savings. It is difficult to see the bottom of the hole that we are plummeting into because of the highly deregulated and non-transparent economic regime that has been fashioned over the last quarter century. In order for us to successfully dig ourselves out of this mess, we need to be clear as to what caused it, what the alternatives are to running an economy the way that we've run it over this last little while. The ideas of the economic elites demanding unfettered markets, no matter how uneven their operational outcomes, as articulated by Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, the gurus of monetarism, have been discredited. Financial markets involve real people making decisions, as Finn was saying. They operate on the basis of their interests and seek to maximize profitability. But these interests often conflict with the social and economic laws of other members of society and of the nation. That is why regulation is essential to ensure some degree of balance and microeconomic management. Two principles I think are essential to containing and reversing the crisis. One is that to ensure economic stability, the economy must be sustainable. And that means it must provide benefits to all, not just some segments of the population. The choice between equality on one side, on the one hand, and productivity on the other one is a false one. We know that, certainly know that from the experiences of countries in Scandinavia that have done a better job of balancing the economy. It has been proven wrong also in many countries in the South where these arguments were made. Economic stability, balance, and equitable economic growth are essential ingredients in creating economic success and sustainability. Secondly, markets are social institutions that must be regulated to ensure that they produce desirable outcomes that are consistent with balance, equitability, and sustainability. In essence, we should be looking to John Maynard Keynes, remember him? And Karl Polanyi, for instance, on how the economy ought to be balanced and how we need to keep the operation of the economy embedded in the priorities of the society. In some ways, the quote from the Prime Minister seems to have brought him full circle, and some people might even say, today we are all post-Keynesians. Now, the reality is that how all of this began is that in the 1970s, in response to the stagflationary crisis, there were debates as to whether the countries whether the economy should be more freer or whether there should be a continuation of some form of demand management. Key structural and social arrangements were altered to ensure maximum flexibility for capital, but also for management. So that labor could be forced to accept less in terms of wages and conditions of work. We embarked on a race to the bottom for workers and communities and a race to the highest level of profits for management and investors. In the United States, under the guidance of Alan Greenspan, and in Canada, under the guidance of John Snow, among others, we saw the emergence of a supply-side government policies that abandoned the demand management policies of the post-war period that had ensured some degree of balance in the economy, leading to levels of worker compensation being depressed substantially, well below living wages, and leading to the depressing of effective demand. Up until we got into, what does that mean? That means I have 2 minutes?
No, that means that you need to wrap up.
Okay. So quickly, let me just say that we got into this period where hedge funds and managers of hedge funds engaged in these processes of creating, speculative process of creating derivatives and new products that allowed for us to a certain extent to continue expanding through credit the ability to consume. It has been speculated that there are $600 trillion worth of derivatives in the system, 10 times the worth of the global economy, most of which are not fully covered by the reserves that the financial institutions have. Clearly, this is what Susan Strange was talking about when she said that the economy was subject to some form of casino capitalism. The problem, of course, is that what this has done is it's created tremendous inequality in society. In the Canadian context, 20% of the highest earners of families are responsible for about 75% of the wealth of the country. And Freddie Mac, the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac customers who need to have housing. Housing is a basic need. People should be able to have houses. People should be able to buy houses. They did not have enough revenue to sustain the mortgages because their wages were depressed. There's a direct relationship between an economy that concentrates wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people and leads to higher and higher income polarization and the inevitability that the majority of the people who otherwise should have been consuming cannot because they do not have the capacity to consume. And unfortunately, the majority of the people who suffer are those who are most vulnerable. And that's why you see a rise in the working poor as a component of those who are poor, mostly women, mostly racialized people, mostly immigrants and young people. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
You out there, but we need to leave enough time for people to ask questions when we get there. A curious footnote on deficits. We're thinking about the Roosevelt era today. The whole notion of deficits, whether you agree with them or not, didn't start until 70 years ago when Roosevelt was convinced during the middle of his term with the second New Deal, as it were, that this might not be such a bad idea. So it's just one of those interesting footnotes. As Grace Edward was saying, Canada is in a better position, perceived to be, than most places. And one of the other reasons that they say we're in a better position is because of the governance of our banks. So on that note, I will turn things over to our man from the bank, Derek Broughton.
So I'm in the forecasting game these days, and it certainly isn't very easy, I'll tell you that. In a nutshell, what do we expect? Where do we see all this ending? We do think we will pull out of this eventually. It's going to take a while. But I think eventually all these central bank governed actions are going to stick to some extent. Some of these problems in the credit markets are going to dissipate, hopefully by the end of next year. So we're still a number of quarters away before we actually begin to see recovery. The U.S. housing market bottoms out, begins to pull out, and the world economy benefits. I just don't see us going back to the growth we had before. That growth was special growth. It was growth driven by China, by U.S. economy that, as we've been talking about, was fueled by just a booming housing market and everybody wanting a piece of it. That's gone, and there will be legacies of this that will impact the global economy for a long time. The U.S. won't go back to the kind of growth rates we've seen. It's going to grow quite slowly as the leveraging, refer to just the fact that individuals, it'll take some time to get over the debt hangover, and it's going to weigh on the global economy. So, but all that to say that we will get out of this. We're not going back to the way we were before. I could talk at ends about our global growth outlook. I wanted to kind of take a bit of a different track here, because there's something that I am I'm obviously concerned about the next year or two, particularly for Ontario, which is very much a manufactured-driven economy, very reliant on the U.S. auto sector. The things we produce here are the sectors that are getting hit the hardest in the United States. And so it's not going to be easy for this Ontario economy. That said, I'm even more concerned about the longer term of where this economy is headed. Because, you think about where Ontario generated a lot of its wealth in the past. It was driven on an industrial base that in turn was driven by relatively free access to the U.S. market. It was driven by relatively low, cheap energy supply. I'm not just talking about crude oil, but energy as well, subsidized energy, electricity rather. Now, we can argue that oil's down to 50, but its long-term average is closer to 30, even in real terms. I don't think we're going to go down that low, and even if we do, it's going to be a temporary phenomenon. I see oil back up to $75 probably within a year. It's not going back to 125 because that, as I say, was part of this leveraging bubble we were in, but I still think that the Chinas of the world will continue to grow. It's a young economy. It will continue to industrialize, and that will have some impact on commodity markets. Ontario is a net importer of oil. So that's going to be a trouble spot even going forward. It's not going back to $30 a barrel. The exchange rate, perhaps most importantly, isn't going back to 63 US cents. It might, who knows in the near term. If there are other bouts of panic and more flight to safety in the US dollar, then it could very well move to levels that we haven't foreseen. But I do think that'll be a temporary thing. And we've been long arguing that a reasonable value for the currency is closer to 80 cents. And that's approximately where it is right now, even in this kind of doom and gloom situation. So I think the message here is that wealth created by all these factors in the U.S., even when it recovers, that access to the U.S. market since 9/11, it's never been the same. And there are even concerns about potential protectionism. So it really means that Ontario's got to look for a new type of prosperity. We're not going back to the way we were before. I'm thinking that until recently, a lot of this was hidden. If you had told me the dollar was going to parity, energy was doing this, I would have thought this economy would have folded over. But it hasn't. It actually has grown. It hasn't grown rapidly, but it's grown. And the reason is there's been all these offsetting factors. There's been growth in housing that generates benefits not just for manufacturing, but for other things. You had governments that have been hiring, as they've been, even in Ontario, recording surpluses. We don't get the resource royalties here in the West, but even then, the government was recording big surpluses and redistributing them. That has benefited growth. Infrastructure spending benefited the economy. Unfortunately, these offsets aren't in place to the same extent. Government's probably going to continue to spend, but I don't think it can continue to spend at the same rate, even if there will be fiscal packages and stimulus packages. So I think the point is that masking effect is changing. And the other thing that I'm concerned about is this notion of the manufacturing sector, which has provided very high quality of life for a lot of workers, auto sector workers making in the six figures. I think that's a thing of the past. I really do. I'm looking at the U.S. auto sector, and we could have a whole discussion about the auto sector here. But already that sector has shifted. The last UAW agreement announced any workers introduced have Tier 1, Tier 2 at $18 an hour. That's well below the wages that were paid before with benefits. And so the U.S. has already started to move, but Canada hasn't. And this is it's rippling through parts. You've got Delphi of the U.S. is going to emerge from bankruptcy protection, probably paying $16 to $18 an hour. That's a lot less than companies here, particularly the unionized ones that were paying with benefits, again, upward of $50, $60 an hour, including overtime. So, I think you're getting my point here is that things are shifting. Now, what does Ontario government, what do the stakeholders in Ontario do about this? Because I mentioned this new prosperity that we've got to achieve. It's got to take bold action. And I do think that despite the deficit challenges that governments are going to be facing, some of the pieces are going to have to be put in place even in the near term. By the way, this is a report that's on our website that I'm extracting this from that we released at the end of September. And even with the kind of further deepening of the crisis, still stand very much by that fact. Oil's even lower, but we still stand very much by all this information. We identified 9 areas that Ontario government needs to very aggressively address to get us to where we want to go. And to get us where we want to go as well, we need them to map out a roadmap of where they see the Ontario economy in 2020. All the focus is going to be on the near term, but as soon as possible, they need to map like a vision 2020, where they plan to take this economy down the road, and some of the areas they need to address. But in a nutshell, and I don't have, unfortunately, time to go through all these in my 10-minute allotment, because you've seen that the moderator get around to addressing. But I will mention a few things. I don't think any of these are going to bowl you over, but it is a fairly broad strategy, and I think it's important to point out that a lot of the pieces have been put in place already. I think about labor force quality. I think Ontario's done a great job with the Ray Commission. A lot of the recommendations of post-secondary education that were put in place there have been adopted, and that's very unusual for a task force to do that. They were adopted, they were strong recommendations. The Higher Council on Learning will now monitor the improvements in post-secondary education. That's an example of where I think we've hit the ground running. Other areas we have much more work to do. effective integration of new immigrants to the area. It's just, some of the pieces have been put in place, but it's just a huge vulnerability. And we think about a lot of the Ontarians that are struggling are these new Canadians. They're not closing the gap at all. They arrive here, and the wage gap with natural born is just increasing, despite the fact they come with more education credentials than average. It's not a gap that's closing. So we've got to put better policies in place to deal with those. I'm thinking some of it's related to selection. I mean, the federal government, and we saw this in the census data, and this is interesting, is that the federal government targeted computer workers, in the first half of this decade. But that was backward looking. That policy was set during the heyday of the IT bubble. And that imploded, and all of a sudden, these workers are brought in, and there was a huge share of the new workers brought in were of this background. Unfortunately, there were no jobs, and their wages were miles below that, and they struggled to get jobs. So a lot of it involves Ontario being more actively involved. Infrastructure, metro links, I think that's a big plan. We've heard about $50 billion, but I think funding's only been secured until 2013, about a quarter of that. The policies, there's just very little governance power of that group. They can't set their policies complementary with the kind of policies we need to prevent urban sprawl, the things we need to do to deliver, things more effectively. Infrastructure is key, and obviously this is something we talk about. Governments are going to be jumping on this, continue to, because this is an area that's going to buoy our economy. So this is a good thing. But let's more effectively allocate that money, and it's through groups like Metrolinx that we're going to be relying on to put in place the infrastructure of this century. Reliable electricity. Coal's going to be 1 minute. I'm running out. I'm just going to quickly list them. It'll take me the rest. Reliable electricity. Leader in the environment. We've got a lot of environmental expertise up here. Carbon pricing. Not just as a revenue grab, but it could raise revenue for other sources. Competitive tax system, a lot of the areas there we could talk about. Enhanced trade, shift from dependence welfare to labor force participation. We could have a good chat about the welfare system here and the asset limits and how they actually take away from getting people more involved in the workforce. Supportive federal policy. I'll end off on that. I mean, it's amazing. We're a have-not province now in Ontario, but can you believe we're still a huge contributor to net federal coffers to the tune of about 20 million. That's 20 billion rather. That's net versus what they put in. So, that's an area that over time we need to address. So I've got to stop there, but maybe we can carry on. Thanks.
My continuing little list of Roosevelt trivia bits. One of the things that I think Roosevelt did was the Civilian Conservation Corps sent out unemployed people, and they planted 1 billion trees. This was in the 30s between Texas right up to the Canadian border. It's pretty impressive and not something we would have thought of coming out of that period. All right, visions. Where is Ontario going to be in 2020? We've got to do something new. Peter Victor, why don't you talk about that?
My basic message is that we are not facing one crisis, we're facing two, that we need to address them both together, and if I do run out of time, it'll be when I'm trying to give you some ideas about how we might do that. So what are the two crises? Well, we've heard a lot this evening already about the global economic crisis. That's clearly one. But let's not forget that we are facing, to my mind, an even more serious and difficult to resolve global environmental crisis. Just a couple of elements of that crisis. There's been a series of publications by the International Panel on Climate Change at 5-yearly intervals, each one telling us that the problem is worse than the previous report said it was. And then in 2005, we had the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which looked at all of the ecosystem services we rely on as a species, and our economy relies on them too. This is their first finding. Approximately 60% of the ecosystem services examined are being degraded or used unsustainably, including freshwater, captive fisheries, air and water purification, regulation of regional and local climate, natural hazards, and pests. And just finally to mention that species extinction is happening at an unprecedented rate. Currently, it's estimated at about 1,000 times faster than in the fossil record, and it's projected to increase a further tenfold. So we've got two crises. Now, the problem is that they're interrelated, or not the problem, it's just a fact of life that they're interrelated. And I say this because I think a lot of our pressure on the environment comes from the massive growth in economic output in human population that we've witnessed over whatever period you care to mention, going back as far as a couple of hundred years. But more recently, if you look at the data from 1980 to 2005, there was a 45% increase in global resource extraction over that period. So by the end of that period, we were taking 45% more material from the planet than we were at the beginning to feed our economies. We were using 60% more energy to do that, and in the consumption of all the products. So clearly there's a very close relationship between our expanding economies and the impact on the environment. The destruction of habitat, which is causing the species extinction, comes from agriculture, mining, logging, trawling, and urban sprawl. So you can see we've got a whole range of issues that somehow we have to grapple with simultaneously. Let's not forget that, as some of the other speakers have said, social implications of these kinds of changes are dramatic and have to be addressed, and we're not all equally vulnerable, nor are we equally culpable. There's variation within the country and across the world. Now, I try to take an optimistic view in all this, that I think that the economic crisis may give us the opportunity and impetus to address the environmental crisis in ways that so far we've been unable and unwilling to do. And let me just point out, before I give you some of my ideas, just how some commonalities between these two crises, the economic and the environmental. First of all, I believe that no matter how smart we are, we have an inadequate understanding of the systems, the financial system, the economic system, and the environmental system, and we're suffering from that. We have brought about a reduction in the resilience of our financial and economic system, I think partly due to globalization, and also on the environmental system because of the loss of diversity. So both of these sets of systems have become less able to deal with these shocks that they're now receiving. Both, in a sense, involve credit, living beyond our means, living beyond our economic and financial means, has been explained, but also living beyond our environmental and resource means. We suffer in both arenas from weak and non-existent, sometimes national and international regulatory oversight. We have inadequate information about how these systems function, and there's inadequate information within the systems. I am an economist. I happen to have less confidence in the information carried in prices than most economists do. And I say that, and I make that argument largely because of the environmental crisis. Prices do not generally contain information about how big an economy should be. One of the things that we've seen on the financial side is that we've seen all these errors in the evaluation of assets. The same is true on the environmental side. We're just not very good at valuing environmental assets. That's led to a poor assessment of the risks that we face when we make decisions, and that leads to bad decisions. Decisions often where we put too much emphasis on the short term and insufficient consideration for the long term. Finally, I'll mention that in both arenas, economic and environmental, there's often a separation between those who make the decisions and those who bear the consequences. It's not a satisfactory arrangement at all. But it would be a mistake to think that you've got an economic system here and an environmental system here. We've somehow got to find some sort of balance. It's often presented that way. I think that's a mistake. The best way to understand an economic system is that it's embedded in the biosphere. We can have a biosphere without an economy. You can't have an economy without a biosphere. The economies get their materials and energy from the biosphere, and they use that, and because of certain physical laws, it doesn't disappear. It goes back into the biosphere as waste products, and as those quantities mount, the impacts get greater and greater, and I've touched on some of those. So what should we do? Well, here's some suggestions. First of all, we've got to make the real economy operate within the limits of the biosphere. It hasn't been doing that for a long time. We've got to somehow find a way to do that. Here are some principles that we could work with. For renewable resources, we shouldn't harvest beyond the regeneration rate. Well, if you do that, you deplete the stock from which you're getting the renewable resource. For non-renewable resources, if we're going to get any benefit from them, we have to use them, but we should take some of the revenues from using the non-renewable resources to invest into renewable alternatives. That doesn't happen in any kind of planned way, and it doesn't happen in an unplanned way either. It happens in a happenstance way, and that's not good enough. For waste emissions, we shouldn't exceed the assimilative capacity. That's why we've got a problem with climate change. We're putting too many greenhouse gases into the atmosphere for the natural processes to cope with. And for habitat protection, we've got to have better land use planning. So that's one set of proposals. We've got to make the financial economy serve the real economy. One of the things that I've enjoyed and appreciated about the current discussion around the economic crisis is that it's become publicly known that there's a financial economy and a real economy, and they're not the same thing. And I think one of the ways of looking at our economic crisis is that the financial economy came to dominate the situation instead of being a servant to the real economy. We should invest in green infrastructure, in other words, rail over air and roads, renewable energy over coal and nuclear. We should promote green production processes and products and services. We should promote cradle-to-cradle ideas, industrial ecology, biomimicry. There's lots of good stuff out there for us to draw upon, but we have to have policies that will drive these home. We should specifically set out to decarbonize the economy. It is a massive challenge. I'm not at all confident we're capable of doing it, but I think pricing carbon, as another speaker has said, is a key ingredient for that. On a larger scale, we need to practice ecological fiscal reform. By that is meant looking at the whole government expenditure and revenues and going through it and saying, okay, what's promoting a more secure and stable environment and what is undermining that, and making adjustments to the whole government fiscal structure along those lines. We have to work on scale and efficiency. It's very common for people to say, let's have more efficient cars, more efficient equipment and all of this, and that'll help the environment. But it so often gets undermined because those things happen at the same time as the scale of the activity increases. So you're going to have a more efficient automobile, but if you have too many more cars, the net effect is negative, not positive. By the way, that problem was identified 1865 by Jevons, and it's called the Jevons paradox today, but unfortunately in policy terms we don't pay enough attention to that. We generally think the bigger the scale, the better. So I think we need to readdress that. When it comes to technological progress, I'm not a Luddite, but I do believe we should turn to technological progress for giving us more free time rather than more goods and services in a country like Canada, which is essentially a very wealthy country. And I think, just to finish, in a country of this sort, we need to dethrone economic growth as the overarching policy objective of government. And as was mentioned kindly by Karen in the introductory remarks, I've written a book where I argue that case, and invite you to take a look at it if you think some of what I've said to you to this point is of interest. Thank you very much.
All right, a bunch of stuff has been thrown out here. We want to entertain questions from you and to have some sort of discussion back and forth. That's the object at the moment. I also am at this point, having talked about the economy, supposed to remind you, if you feel so inclined, to donate to a fund for future forum activities, because I guess we can't talk about things unless there's some money to pay for the hall, etc. All right, do we have questions, and how are we going to work this out?
What has been revealed very clearly is that you cannot have an economy that is a sustainable economy unless and if you have an equitable economy. But it does make a difference when significant segments of the population do not have access to enough income for them to be able to be effective consumers. It makes a difference. It matters. It matters that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have a portfolio with a whole bunch of people who cannot afford their mortgages, and yet they need housing, right? So the idea is that we need to have an economy where people have an economy that is equitable. Equitable in terms of workers should be able to bargain effectively with their employers for good wages. People who work 8-hour days should not be living below the poverty line. And access to that economy should also be equitable. Every segment of the population, whether those are women or racialized people, or new immigrants or young people, should be able to have access to jobs, to good jobs, so that they can be part of the, they can be part of the economy in a meaningful way. I think that is really essential. I think we will see some of that happen if we continue to insist that there is no trade-off between productivity on the one hand and equality on the other hand.
So it's the basic principle that poor people are bad for the economy, that a more affluent middle class stimulates everything and gets things moving.
And that is the one thing that I think John Wayne and Keynes showed very clearly.
All right, Grace Edward, I'm going to ask you to pause there, and I hope that gives you some of an answer to that question.
The U.S. dollar was a safer place that the U.S. dollar was a flight to safety. And my question is why is the U.S. dollar still considered safe when in the past few months in particular they've printed so many of them and loaned, I think, the something like $4 trillion or printed $4 trillion, which is more than the cost of the Second World War and the whole Marshall Plan and the Vietnam War and all these other things. And what will happen when the world finally realizes that there is nothing real behind those dollars?
It's monopoly money.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Derek?
Yeah, I think that was me, actually. You know, I've been somewhat surprised, as you have, that sort of the epicenter of this whole problem is actually seeing its currency strengthen the most on a trend basis. You know, I think the big part of the explanation there is the U.S. dollar is still viewed as the reserve currency. I mean, for instance, commodity prices are still priced in U.S. dollars, despite some murmurings about OPEC in recent years about potentially shifting away. You know, it would be a very different scenario right now if it was just the U.S. that was facing all these challenges and everybody else was kind of skating immune from it, but it isn't. I mean, Europe, if anything, had more of a leveraging challenge than the U.S. did, and you can see the kind of actions their governments are taking. So the euro might have been the logical, you know, safe haven during this, but unfortunately, this economy is going to struggle, and it's still got structural issues that it's going to deal with. So I think it's more just by default, really, that, you know, that the U.S. Treasury, the U.S. Treasury bond is still viewed as the place that investors want to run and hide. I mean, it's obvious that, you know, despite, and I guess the other thing is that if there were fears that the U.S. government was going to run up against the debt wall, then maybe it would be a little bit different. But, you know, despite all these trillions, and obviously it's changing by the day, the more actions taken, the bigger the risk of a big, I mean, now Obama's talking about a $700 billion stimulus package. But, you know, the fact of the matter is the U.S. debt to GDP ratio isn't all that high when you compare it against a lot of other countries. So, again, it's changing, but so I think that's maybe part of the explanation, is just that everybody is being brought under this. It sort of means by default the U.S. dollar remains the safe haven. Now, your second part of your question after that was what's going to happen. Sorry?
I was going to cut you off and turn it over to Phil.
Okay.
So, I mean, can we just go back and forth?
Yeah.
You wanted to add something.
Oh, sure. Just one quick bullet of that. We were talking, Derek mentioned deleveraging, which sort of unwinding some of all the credit provision in the economy. So the reason I mention that is that the amount of credit being supplied to the economy by financial institutions has overall in the U.S. has pulled back a significant amount. So the $4 trillion we're talking about isn't in addition to the money supply. It's not necessarily as inflationary as you might think.
And Derek, did you want to add, pursuant to the second part of the question?
Yeah, just we actually do see the U.S. dollar weakening on a trend basis, but that's after we get over the hump. I do think that some of this is going to come back to push down the U.S. dollar, but I think we got to get over the sort of the panic stage first and get into a little bit more normality. I do think, because I mean, you've seen how much it's strengthened recently. Some of that's got to come out of it. But you know, and you could, is the U.S. dollar going to hit crisis eventually? I mean, that with the kind of current account deficits they face. You know, it's still a risk. It's a longer-term risk, and as I mentioned in my comments, some of the legacy of all this borrowing is still going to be a worry. But just a few ideas there.
Thank you.
Like you were saying, you immediately flipped to my research I was doing a couple of months ago. The Murray Delta Basin, I don't know if you know anything about it, most people probably don't. It was a wonderful place just 3 years ago. I happened to hear overnight on CBC a report by the BBC of the devastation of this wonderful place in Australia. Great big lakes, sort of thing. I started looking on the internet. All I could find was Pristine State 2001, 2003, 2000.
Well, there was a president who once said, "It's the economy, stupid." Well, that was 20th century. We have got to understand the economy is part of the environment, stupid, and that precedent we haven't yet got. That is the problem with the world. I agree with Victor that there are at least two problems, economy and environment, but I suggest there are four problems. Two more let me add. One is there is an ethical problem. too many fat asses are deciding on the hungry world. That's one problem.
Sir, I'm going to ask you to come to your question.
Yeah, well, let me first pose the perspective. And the fourth one is that we are so married to the democratic way, and it moves so slowly. We had the report in 1972 of limits to growth, and what have we got for the last 30 years? Growth, growth, and growth. When are we getting rid of our blinders that are covered with democratic procedure and methods? I think we have got to do something different.
Sir, now, are you advocating a benign dictatorship?
No, I'm not saying that.
The crisis gives us the opportunity to do that. What is really incredible, of course, is that, in essence, President-elect Obama has already suggested that he was going to spend massive amounts of money to do infrastructure, physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, precisely the kinds of things that we should have been doing. The economy should be doing that. It should be providing for the needs of the people. It should, I'm sorry? It should have been doing that. It should provide for the needs. If it is not doing that, there is something wrong. And I think that that is the message that around which we need to mobilize people. What is wrong with this economy? It's now clear what is wrong with the economy. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And I suggest a couple of things. One is that the government needs to have a much greater role in the economy than it has over the last little while. Two is that we need more democracy in the way the economy is organized. People should be more involved, whether through their workplaces or through other means, in the decision making that determines how the economy works. Three is the economy should be more equitable. We should have greater equity in terms of access to the labor market, in terms of access to the resources of society. I think that can be a basis for us to look forward to a different kind of economy than the one that we had. One that is more transparent, where decision making is more transparent, so that we know what is going on in the financial institution.
I think that's the important thing. We do want to see those incomes growing quite rapidly, regardless of what's going on in the second quarter, the top quartile or whatever. So I think that's the important issue. And they haven't been growing quickly enough, obviously.
Give you more
We
business.
want to wrap on the top 10.
You wanted to add something?
Well, I have looked at the data, and so much depends upon what you take as your starting point and your end point as to whether things have gone up or down. And in terms of income distribution, it depends upon whether you look at incomes before taxes and benefits have been paid or after. So it's a very complicated issue, and you can draw different conclusions even when you look at the same data.
But it's less complicated if you're just looking at one income level rather than always taking ratios. And
No, but
I mean, if the top end is falling,
one of the points has been.
Okay, you know
You're
what?
professionals. You should know this information. I don't get paid to do this, but I know it. So,
No, take your point.
study your history, people. We're going into a bad place. The depression is coming. It's inevitable.
Okay. All right, then I'm going to
Invest
ask,
wisely.
what's happened
We're
to
pretty
my
much screwed.
RRSP, Derek? Where's it gone?
well, it's been a very difficult time.
What I'm saying is that people don't know the answers because they don't know the history.
Okay,
we need
sir,
to,
I
as
am
people,
going to ask
learn.
you to leave the microphone now.
Okay.
please, just so
Learn,
other
people,
can have a
learn.
chance. Thank you. All right. Sir, same microphone.
Of the environment, our infrastructure, poverty, society growth. So I'm wondering, besides pricing the other evils that we know about, like carbon or methane, or now we've got a new one, nitrogen trifluoride, which is 20 times worse than carbon dioxide in terms of greenhouse gas effect. In terms of running around trying to price those individual evils, is there a measure, a better measure, that will give us a more significant sense of success or real human wealth in the world that would take quality of life and quality of global services, ability that our grandchildren will actually be able to live a meaningful life and they've got a world as good as we received?
You mean describe those
So,
things
so
in value and
can
put
we
it
bundle
into a-
that into some
Yeah.
other measure? Because obviously GDP that adds $10 billion to GDP because of Exxon Valdez, and we've got all that work to do of cleaning up the oil we spilled, is a positive effect on
Right,
GDP.
right.
Is there a better measure for us?
Peter?
Well, there are a number of candidate alternatives, but they're not being promoted anything like GDP. There's a genuine progress indicator, which starts from GDP and then takes some things out of the sort you mentioned, which just shouldn't be there if you wish to use the statistic to measure well-being, and add some other things in. And that shows a very clear divergence between what GDP shows over the last 30 years and the genuine progress indicator. Very little progress as measured by that. There's the so-called dashboard of sustainability, which you can get on the internet, which is really quite neat, allows you to apply your own weights to many different considerations, and for all the countries in the world. There's the Environmental Sustainability Index that comes out of Yale, which has about 75 different parameters. And again, it's quite nicely set up so that people like us can make use of it. There's the ecological footprint that you must have come across, which tries to measure the burden that we place as individuals or as communities or as a nation.
Okay, could you just say your name and say what your profession is and what you think about this forum on the global economy crisis?
My name is Grace Edward Galabuzzi. I work at Ryerson University as a professor of politics and public administration.
Okay, and so why are you here today to talk about the economy?
I am here today for two reasons. One is that, like most people, I'm concerned about the impact of the global financial crisis on the lives of people in Canada, but also globally. Two is that I see this as an opportunity for us to challenge some of the dogma around how to organize the economy that has been so difficult to challenge over the last little while. We're at a point where the way to organize the economy needs to change. We cannot keep doing the same thing that we've been doing. We certainly need the government to have a greater role in the economy to ensure that the public interest is secured. We need to ensure that the relationship between those who produce as well as those who organize production changes so that it is more balanced than it has been in the last little while. We need to make sure that access to the labor markets is more equitable than it has been in the last little while. And we need at the end of the day to make sure that there's greater transparency in the financial markets.
Okay, so what advice could you give to the individual as a consumer, or like what can the individual do about this crisis?
I think as an individual it's very difficult to figure out what to do because I think most individuals are impacted by the crisis. But I think that what we need to do is to organize with other people who are concerned about the impact of this crisis so that we can get our government to act more proactively, so that we can address issues of how the economy should be organized. I think that we need to talk about alternatives to how the economy is organized, and that is something that we can put on the table if we organize ourselves, whether as people in communities who have not benefited very much from the economy to this point, or as workers who have not benefited or who have been disadvantaged by the way the economy has been organized.
Okay, so you mentioned that more government involvement. Are you saying that the government can help with its policies in changing the economy?
Absolutely. The government is the most dominant institution in society, which is organized on the basis of the will of the people. Okay? Corporations are not organized on the basis of the will of the people. The economy, increasingly, because it is based on unfettered markets, is not organized on the basis of the people. So what we have as an instrument to engage in the economy to make sure that the economy is fairer is the government. The government is made up of our representatives. And so we need to ensure that our representatives use the levers of power to intervene in the economy on our behalf.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing your knowledge. Could you just say your name and your profession and talk about a bit about the book that you just wrote?
Right. My name is Peter Victor. I'm a professor in environmental studies at York University. I'm an economist. I'm an economist who, in particular, studies the relationship between the economy and the environment. And over the years, I've come to the view that the commitment that our economy or our society has made to the pursuit of economic growth is now misguided, and that we should see if it's possible to manage without economic growth. So in the book, I look at the history of economic growth. Where did the idea come from? I look at on what it's based. I look at where the commitment of government to promote economic growth came from. It's actually quite a recent phenomenon. It only goes back to the end of the Second World War. And I look at a whole set of reasons as to why we can't sustain continued economic growth. The most important of those reasons is that the natural environment is being put under increased stress to provide the materials and energy of a growing economy and to provide a place to put all the waste products. And so what I do in the book is I say, okay, well, could we have full employment? Could we eradicate poverty? Could we protect the environment in an economy that was no longer growing? And I show that, yes, under some circumstances, that could be possible.
Okay, so could you just show your book maybe and the title and...
The book is entitled Managing Without Growth.
And it's you show how the environment and the economy are linked.
Definitely I show how they are linked. I show, more importantly than that, how the economy depends on the environment. It's embedded in the environment. It's not just we could have environment or economy. We can't have the economy if we don't take care of the environment.
Okay, so do you think that switching to green, clean, sustainable sources of energy is better for the economy?
I certainly think it's better for the environment, and I suppose, yes, I would say in my terms it's better for the economy. It offers us opportunities for employment that the more heavily polluting and material wasting technologies are no longer able to offer, and it provides us an opportunity to move in that direction, yes.
Okay, so does the book actually, does it have a plan there to...
Well, a plan would be too strong a word. It has a chapter on policies where I look at what it would mean for consumption, for investment, for government expenditure, for immigration, for technology. I have a lot of things to say about all of those topics. But it's certainly not the last word on those issues. It's an attempt to stimulate a discussion about these very important topics.
Okay, so I don't know if this will, I was just wondering if you have any advice to the individual as a consumer, or what could you give advice to the individual person on how to handle?
Well, I really appreciate the question. This is not a self-help book. There are plenty of those around. It's a book which takes the view that if we're going to solve these problems, we have to act collectively, which means through better policy, through actions that we can only take as a group. For example, as an individual, your choices can't make any difference to the availability of public transit. You either get the bus or you don't, but nobody puts on a new bus to run just because of that. That's true of any of us as individuals. However, if we act as a group, we can make a decision to have more public transit. So that's an example of how we need to act collectively to help solve the problems.
Okay, so thanks a lot for sharing your knowledge.
You're very welcome.